The year is 1412, and the world sleeps uneasily. Across the rolling hills and river valleys of France, smoke rises from countless villages where the fires of war have left their mark. The autumn mist clings to the countryside like a shroud, and in the distance the sound of church bells mingles with something else, the faint echo of marching feet, the creak of armor, the whispered prayers of those who wonder if tomorrow will bring salvation or sorrow. This is a France divided, a kingdom torn between two worlds. For more than 70 years now, the 100 Years' War has raged between France and England, turning fertile fields into battlegrounds and transforming peaceful villages into fortresses. It is a conflict that has stretched across generations, outliving kings and queens, outliving entire families who have known nothing but the rhythm of siege and surrender, victory and defeat. The English, with their long bows and their claims to the French throne, hold much of the north. From their strongholds in Normandy and Aquitaine, they have pressed deeper into the heart of France, their banners flying over towns that once knew only French rule. The great city of Paris itself lies under English control, its streets patrolled by foreign soldiers, its people caught between loyalty and survival. But this is more than just a war between two nations. It is a war of succession, a question that echoes through every castle hall and cathedral nave. Who is the rightful king of France? The English claim their monarch, young Henry VI, is the true heir through his grandfather's conquest. Meanwhile, in the Loire Valley, a French prince called Charles, son of the late King Charles VI, holds court in exile, calling himself Dauphin, but unable to claim his birthright crown. The land itself bears witness to this endless conflict. Stone bridges lie broken in rivers that run red with memory. Ancient castles, built to last 1,000 years, show fresh scars from siege engines and cannon fire. In the countryside, farmers work their fields with one eye on the horizon, ready to abandon everything at the first sign of approaching banners, whether they bear the fleur-de-lis of France or the leopards of England. Yet even in these dark times, life continues with a stubborn, quiet hope. In village churches, candlelight flickers before images of saints who promise protection to the faithful. In taverns and market squares, people speak in hushed voices of prophecies and miracles, of signs in the sky that suggest God has not forgotten France. There are whispers of an ancient legend, a prophecy that speaks of a maiden who will come from the borders of Lorraine to save the kingdom in its darkest hour. The court of the Dauphin. Charles reflects the uncertainty of these times, surrounded by advisers who argue endlessly over strategy and politics. The young prince struggles with doubt that weighs heavier than any crown. At 29, he has known nothing but war and exile. His father's madness, his mother's alleged betrayals, and the constant questioning of his own legitimacy have left him a shadow of the king he might have been. His court moves from castle to castle like a band of wanderers, never staying long in any one place, always aware that English armies could appear at any moment. The nobles who serve Charles are themselves divided. Some, like Arthur de Richemont, the Constable of France, are seasoned warriors who have fought the English for decades. Others, like Georges de la Trémoille, the royal favourite, are more concerned with political manoeuvring than military action. Between them all hangs the question that no one dares speak aloud. Is this war already lost? Has France's time as a sovereign nation come to an end? In the great cathedral cities, Reims, where French kings have been crowned for centuries, Orléans, the key to the southern provinces, Rouen, now firmly in English hands, the stones themselves seem to hold their breath. These are places where history has been made for generations, where the sacred and the political have always intertwined. Now they wait, as all of France waits, for some sign of what is to come. The people of France, caught between these great powers, have learned to read the signs of war like farmers read the weather. They know the difference between the dust clouds raised by merchants and those raised by cavalry. They can tell from the sound of bells whether they ring for mass or for alarm. Children grow up playing games of siege and rescue, their innocent laughter echoing through villages that have seen too much of the real thing. In the markets and town squares, traveling merchants bring news from across the kingdom. They speak of battles won and lost, of cities changing hands, of new taxes levied to fund armies that seem to accomplish little. But they also bring other kinds of stories, tales of miraculous rescues, of prayers answered, of divine intervention in desperate moments. These stories spread like ripples in a pond, carrying hope to places where hope has become a precious and rare commodity. The Church, that great pillar of medieval society, struggles to maintain its authority over a divided land. Bishops find themselves serving different masters depending on which army controls their dioceses. Monks in their monasteries copy manuscripts and tend their gardens while listening for the sounds of approaching danger. Parish priests offer comfort to their flocks while wondering if their churches will still stand come spring. Yet faith remains strong, perhaps stronger than ever in these trials. The suffering of the present moment seems to intensify people's longing for divine deliverance. Pilgrims still journey to holy shrines, carrying prayers and offerings, seeking intercession from saints who understand human pain. The names of Michael the Archangel, Margaret the Martyr, and Catherine the Scholar are whispered in countless prayers, their images carved in stone and painted on church walls throughout the kingdom. In this world of uncertainty, certain rhythms persist. The seasons still turn, bringing harvest and planting, feast days and fasting. Village festivals still mark the calendar, though they are smaller now, more cautious. Young people still fall in love and marry, despite not knowing what kind of world they are bringing their children into. Old people still gather by firesides to tell the ancient stories, the tales of Charlemagne and Roland, of Christian knights and miraculous victories that seem to belong to another age entirely. The physical landscape of France tells its own story of conflict. Roads that once carried pilgrims and merchants now serve primarily for military purposes. Towns have grown walls and watchtowers where once they had only marketplaces and gardens. The countryside, naturally beautiful with its rolling hills and fertile valleys, bears the scars of armies that have passed through like storms, leaving destruction in their wake. But nature, in its patient way, begins always to heal. Wildflowers bloom in the ruins of burned villages. Trees grow back in forests cleared for siege weapons. Rivers run clear again after the armies have passed. There is something in this resilience of the natural world that speaks to the deeper resilience of the human spirit. A reminder that even the longest night must eventually give way to dawn. As we move deeper into this story, As the mists of morning begin to part and reveal the landscape more clearly, our attention turns to a particular place, a small village near the border of Lorraine. It is there, in a world that seems forgotten by kings and armies, that our story truly begins. For in that quiet place called Domrémy, in a simple house where an ordinary family goes about the business of daily life, something extraordinary is about to unfold. The stage is set, the players are in their positions, and the great drama that will reshape not just France, but the understanding of what one person, inspired by faith and driven by conviction, can accomplish in the face of seemingly impossible odds, is about to begin. In the gathering dusk of this medieval evening, as cooking fires are lit in farmhouse hearths and the last prayers of the day echo in village churches, a child sleeps peacefully, unaware that she will grow to change the course of history itself. In the gentle valley of the Meuse River, where the border between France and the Holy Roman Empire blurs into peaceful farmland, lies the village of Domrémy. It is a place that seems touched by an older, quieter world, a collection of stone houses with thatched roofs, narrow lanes that wind between gardens and orchards, and fields that stretch away toward hills covered in ancient forests. Here, the great conflicts that rage across France feel distant, like thunder from storms that are still far away. The house of Jacques d'Arc sits solidly among its neighbours, built of local stone, with thick walls that speak of permanence and care. Jacques is a man of substance in Domrémy, though his wealth is measured not in gold, but in good land, healthy livestock, and the respect of his fellow villagers. His wife, Isabelle Romay, is known throughout the valley for her piety and her skill in healing, a woman whose prayers are said to have particular power, and whose herb garden provides remedies for ailments both of body and spirit. It is into this household, on a winter day when snow lies deep across the fields and ice forms patterns like prayers on the windows, that a daughter is born. They name her Joan, and from her first breath she seems to carry within her something that sets her apart. Perhaps it is simply the way the candlelight plays across her infant face, or the unusual stillness that falls over the house when she sleeps. But her parents sense that this child will be different from her brothers. Joan grows up in a world where the sacred and the everyday interweave as naturally as threads in her mother's weaving. Each morning begins with prayers, each meal is blessed, each evening ends with the family gathered around the fire, while Isabelle tells stories of saints and miracles. The child learns to see the hand of God in everything, in the return of spring, in the birth of lambs, in the way sunlight streams through the windows of the village church. The parish church of Saint-Rémy stands at the heart of Domrémy, like the hub of a wheel, its bell tower rising above the village roofs to catch the first light of dawn and the last glow of sunset. Here, Joan learns her letters from the priest, Father Guillaume Fronte, a gentleman who recognizes in the young girl an unusual hunger for spiritual truth. While other children fidget during Mass, Joan kneels in rapt attention, her eyes fixed on the altar, as if she can see something there that others cannot. Her childhood unfolds in the rhythm of rural life, helping with the harvest, tending the animals, spinning wool in the long winter evenings. But even in these simple tasks, Joan displays a character that marks her as extraordinary. She gives her own food to beggars, shares her cloak with those who are cold, and spends long hours in the church when her work is done, kneeling before the image of Saint Michael, the warrior archangel who protects France. The village children know Joan as someone special, though they cannot quite say why. She joins in their games, laughs at their jokes, races through the meadows in summer, and builds snow castles in winter. Yet there are moments when she falls silent, her gaze turning distant, as if she is listening to something they cannot hear. During these times, her friends have learned to speak softly around her, sensing that something sacred is taking place. As Joan grows from child to young woman, her beauty becomes evident, not the painted beauty of court ladies, but the natural radiance that comes from a pure heart and a clear conscience. Her hair is dark and thick, often braided with flowers in the summer or tucked under a simple cap in winter. Her eyes are brown and deep, holding a light that seems to come from within. When she smiles, which is often, her whole face illuminates with joy. But it is not her physical beauty that draws people to Joan. It is something deeper, something that manifests in unexpected ways. The village blacksmith finds that his work goes better when Joan stops to speak with him. Sick children seem to recover more quickly after she visits them. Even the village animals respond to her presence with unusual calm and trust. There are whispers that she has been specially blessed, though Joan herself seems unaware of anything unusual in her effect on others. The turning point comes when Joan is 13, on a summer day so perfect it seems crafted by angels. She is in her father's garden, helping to tend the vegetables that will feed the family through the coming winter. The sun is warm on her shoulders, bees hum lazily among the flowers, and the only sounds are the distant lowing of cattle and the splash of the river, running clear and cool at the bottom of the valley. Then, in a moment that will be remembered and recounted for centuries to come, everything changes. A light brighter than the sun itself appears in the garden, though it casts no shadows and brings with it not heat, but a coolness like the breath of heaven. From within this light steps a figure of incredible majesty, the Archangel Michael, captain of the heavenly host, his armor gleaming like captured starlight, his wings spanning wider than any earthly bird's. Joan falls to her knees, not from fear, but from overwhelming awe. The voice that speaks to her is like music made from all the most beautiful sounds she has ever heard. Her mother's lullabies, the church bells on feast days, the song of larks at dawn. Joan, the voice says, and in that single word she hears her entire destiny calling to her. God has seen the suffering of France. You have been chosen to drive out the invaders and see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king. The vision is brief but eternal, lasting perhaps only moments, but changing Joan's understanding of herself and her world forever. When the light fades and the garden returns to its ordinary summer peace, she remains kneeling, tears streaming down her face, tears not of sadness, but of joy so intense it overwhelms her mortal frame. From that day forward, the visions come regularly. Sometimes it is Saint Michael again, sometimes Saint Margaret, the young martyr who faced death rather than deny her faith, sometimes Saint Catherine, the scholar who debated with the wisest men of her time and converted them all to Christianity. Each vision brings the same message, though expressed in different ways. Joan has been chosen by God for a great mission. She must leave Domrémy, seek out the Dauphin Charles and help him claim his rightful throne. At first, Joan tells no one of what she has seen and heard. She continues her daily routine, helps with the household tasks, attends Mass with the same devotion as always. But inside, everything has changed. The world around her seems both more vivid and less important than before. The colors are brighter, the sounds clearer, yet all of it feels like a preparation, a waiting, for the moment when she will step forward into her true calling. Her parents begin to notice changes in their daughter. She spends even more time in prayer, often kneeling in the garden where the first vision occurred, or before the altar in the church. She asks thoughtful questions about the war, about the sufferings of France, about the nature of divine will. When news comes to the village, reports of battles, of towns changing hands, of the ongoing struggle between the Dauphin and the English, Joan listens with an intensity that surprises the adults around her. The other young women of the village are beginning to think about marriage, to notice the young men, and wonder which of them might make good husbands. But Joan shows no interest in such matters. When her parents gently suggest that it might be time to consider her future, she speaks vaguely of having other plans, of waiting for a sign. They assume she is considering religious life, perhaps entry into a convent. And while they would miss her, they respect what seems to be a genuine calling to serve God. What they cannot imagine is the true magnitude of what their daughter is planning. In the quiet hours of night, Joan lies awake, planning her mission. She studies the fragments of information that reach Domrémy about the war, piecing together an understanding of the political and military situation. She prays for guidance about how to convince grown men, nobles and soldiers to listen to a peasant girl from an obscure village. Most of all, she prays for courage, not the courage to face battle, for she has never doubted that God will protect her, but the courage to leave behind everything and everyone she has ever loved. The seasons turn, and Joan turns 16. The visions continue, becoming more urgent, more specific. Saint Michael tells her that time is running short, that Orléans, the great city that guards the approaches to the Dauphin's territories, is under siege and will fall unless she acts soon. The responsibility weighs on her like a physical burden, yet she also feels a growing strength, as if divine power is flowing into her mortal frame, preparing her for the trials ahead. Winter arrives early that year, covering Domrémy in snow that seems deeper and more brilliant than any Joan remembers from her childhood. Standing at her window, looking out over the transformed landscape, she knows that when spring comes, she will no longer be there to see the familiar fields turn green again. Her time of preparation is nearly over. Soon, very soon, she will have to find the courage to tell her family and friends that the quiet girl they have known is about to step onto the stage of history and attempt to change the fate of France itself. Winter settles over Domrémy like a benediction, wrapping the village in silence so complete that even the sound of prayers seems to echo longer in the cold, still air. Joan spends these short, dark days in intense preparation, though to outward appearances she merely continues her usual routine. She helps her mother with the household tasks, tends to the animals, and sits by the fire in the evenings, listening to the familiar stories and songs that have shaped her understanding of the world. But inwardly, she is transforming. Each vision brings new details, new urgency, new understanding of the magnitude of what lies ahead. Saint Michael appears to her now not just in the garden, but in the church, in her chamber, even while she works, always surrounded by that light that seems to come from beyond the physical world, always speaking with that voice that penetrates straight to her soul. The Siege of Orléans grows more desperate each day, he tells her during one winter vision, his great sword gleaming with celestial fire. The English surround the city like wolves around a fold. If it falls, all the south will follow, and France will be lost forever. Joan listens with the complete attention that has become her hallmark, knowing that every word is being burned into her memory for the trials ahead. St. Margaret comes to her as well, appearing often during the evening hours when the household sleeps, and Joan keeps her solitary vigil of prayer. The young martyr speaks to Joan of courage in the face of mockery and disbelief. "Many will question you," she says, her voice gentle but strong. "They will say that God doesn't speak to peasant girls, that women cannot lead armies, that your visions are either delusions or deceptions. You must hold fast to what you know to be true, regardless of what others believe." Saint Catherine, the learned doctor who could debate with emperors and convince them of divine truth, teaches Joan how to speak to those in authority. "You will face scholars and clerks who will try to trap you with clever words," she explains during one particularly vivid vision. "But speak simply and from the heart. Truth has a power that all their learning cannot defeat. When they ask for signs, tell them that the sign will be the relief of Orléans and the coronation of the Dauphin. Let your actions be your proof." As winter deepens, Joan begins to share fragments of her experience with others, testing the waters of belief and disbelief. She speaks to Father Guillaume about the nature of divine calling, asking theoretical questions about how God might choose to work in the world. The priest, recognizing the intensity of her faith, though not yet understanding its specific direction, encourages her to trust in divine providence while being cautious of pride and self-deception. She confides more fully in her friend Durand Laxart, who is married to her cousin and lives in the nearby village of Buret-le-Petit. Durand is a practical man, accustomed to the rhythms of rural life, but he has always recognized something special in young Joan. When she tells him, during a visit to his home, that she believes God has called her to save France, he listens with the attention he might give to the weather or the condition of his crops, seriously, thoughtfully, without immediate judgment. "How can you be certain these visions come from God?" he asks her as they sit by his fire, the winter wind howling outside his windows. "How do you know they are not sent to deceive you?" Joan's answer comes without hesitation, spoken with the confidence of absolute certainty. "Because they call me to sacrifice, not to gain. Because they send me toward danger, not safety. Because they ask me to serve others, not myself. The devil might tempt someone with promises of power or wealth, but he would never command someone to save Christian souls at the cost of her own life." Her words carry such conviction that Durand finds himself believing, though he cannot entirely say why. There is something in Joan's voice, in the light that seems to shine from her eyes when she speaks of her mission, that makes doubt seem not just uncharitable, but impossible. By the time she leaves his house to return to Domrémy, he has promised to help her in whatever way he can. Spring arrives late that year, as if the world itself is reluctant to move forward into whatever changes the new season will bring. But when the snow finally melts and the first green shoots appear in the fields around Domrémy, Joan knows her time of waiting is over. The visions have become more frequent, more insistent. St. Michael appears to her almost daily now, sometimes accompanied by both St. Margaret and St. Catherine, their combined presence filling her with a peace and determination that no earthly power could shake. The final vision comes on a morning in early May, when the air is sweet with the scent of apple blossoms and the sound of bird song fills the valley like a hymn of praise. Joan is kneeling before the altar in the church of Saint-Rémy, having arrived before dawn for private prayer, when the familiar light begins to glow around her. But this time, all three of her heavenly guides appear together, their presence so radiant that Joan wonders the entire church does not burst into flame. "The time has come," St. Michael declares, his voice carrying the authority of heaven itself. "You must leave immediately for Vaucouleurs. There you will seek out Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the garrison. He will be reluctant to believe you at first, but persistence and faith will eventually open his heart. Through him, you will gain access to the Dauphin." St. Margaret steps forward, her martyred hands extended in blessing. "Remember that your strength comes not from yourself, but from God. When you feel afraid, and you will feel afraid, for you are human, turn to prayer. Your faith is your armor, more protective than any steel." St. Catherine speaks last, her scholarly mind evident even in celestial form. "You will be questioned about your mission by learned men who think they can trap you with their arguments. Speak always the truth, simply and directly. When they ask what language your voices use, tell them they speak better French than these questioners do themselves." At this, even in the solemnity of the vision, Joan finds herself smiling at the gentle humor. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vision fades, leaving Joan alone in the church with the morning light streaming through the windows and the sound of the village awakening to another ordinary day. But she knows that for her, ordinary days are now finished forever. She has received her final instructions, and there can be no more delay. The hardest part, Joan realizes as she walks home through the familiar streets of Domrémy, will be saying goodbye. How does one explain to parents who love you that you must leave them, perhaps forever, to fulfill a mission they cannot possibly understand? How does one find words for a calling so extraordinary that it sounds like madness to anyone who has not experienced it themselves? She decides to begin with partial truth, revealing her intentions gradually rather than overwhelming her family with the full magnitude of what she believes herself called to do. That evening, as the family gathers around their fire for the last time, with all of them together, Joan tells her parents that she has been praying about her future and believes God is calling her to serve the Dauphin in some capacity. Her father, Jacques, a man who has lived through decades of war and learned to be suspicious of grand gestures and dramatic claims, responds with predictable concern. "The court is no place for a girl like you," he says, his voice heavy with paternal worry. You know nothing of the ways of nobles and politicians. Stay here, where you are safe, where you are loved. But her mother, Isabel, perhaps drawing on her own deep spiritual intuition, looks at her daughter with eyes that seem to see more than they reveal. If God is truly calling you, she says quietly, then we cannot stand in his way. But Joan, are you certain? Are you absolutely certain that this is not some fancy of your own imagination? Joan's response carries the weight of all her visions, all her prayers, all her preparation for this moment. Mother, she says, taking Isabel's weathered hands in her own young ones, I'm as certain of this as I am that Christ died for our salvation. I would rather stay here with you forever, tend our garden, marry some good man from the village, and live out my days in peace. But God has asked something else of me, and I cannot refuse him. The conversation that follows stretches long into the night, filled with tears and arguments, with prayers and pleading, with the kind of painful honesty that comes when a family faces the prospect of being torn apart by forces beyond their control. By dawn, it is settled. Joan will go to her cousin Durand's house, and from there to Vaucouleurs, where she will seek an audience with Robert de Baudricourt. Her parents' consent comes not from understanding. How could they understand something so far beyond ordinary experience? But from their recognition that their daughter has moved beyond their ability to guide or protect her. She belongs now to something larger than their family, larger than their village, larger perhaps than their own comprehension. The final morning in Domrémy arrives grey and misty, as if the very sky is reluctant to let her go. Joan rises before dawn and walks through the village one last time, visiting the places that have shaped her life. The church where she learned to pray, the garden where she first heard the voice of Saint Michael, the graves of grandparents and friends whose memories have taught her about love and loss. At the door of her family's house, she embraces each of them in turn. Her brothers, still not entirely understanding what is happening, promise awkwardly to take care of their parents. Her father, tears streaming down his weathered face, presses a small bag of coins into her hands, their savings intended for her dowry, now funding a journey he cannot comprehend. Her mother gives her a small wooden cross, worn smooth by years of prayers, and whispers in her ear the blessing that will sustain Joan through all the trials ahead. May God go with you, my daughter. May his angels guard your steps, and his saints intercede for your safety. And may you always remember that whatever happens, however far you travel, you will always have a home here in Domrémy, and parents who love you beyond measure. With those words echoing in her ears, Joan d'Arc turns her face toward the road that leads away from everything familiar and safe, toward a destiny that will shake the foundations of the medieval world. Behind her, the mist is lifting from the valley, revealing the village in all its simple beauty. Ahead of her, unknown roads stretch toward an uncertain but divinely ordained future. The Maid of Domrémy has become Joan of Arc, and the world, though it doesn't yet know it, is about to change forever. The road from Domrémy to Vaucouleurs winds through countryside that still bears the scars of war, yet also shows nature's persistent determination to heal and renew. Joan walks this path with Durand Laxart beside her, her few possessions tied in a simple bundle, her heart carrying the weight of her mission and the lightness of absolute faith. The May morning is fresh and clear, with larks singing in the meadows and the river Meuse catching the early sunlight like scattered coins. Vaucouleurs rises before them like a statement of military purpose. Thick walls, watchful towers, gates that have been built to withstand siege. This is a frontier town, a place where France asserts its authority against the encroaching tide of English conquest. Here, if anywhere, Joan should find men who understand the urgency of her mission, soldiers and commanders who know firsthand the cost of the long war that has devastated their homeland. Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of Vaucouleurs, proves to be exactly what Joan might have expected from a career military man who has spent decades fighting a losing war. Stocky and greying, with the weathered face of someone who has seen too many battles and buried too many friends, he receives the young peasant girl in his hall with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for harmless madness. "You claim that God has sent you to save France?" he asks, his tone suggesting he has heard such claims before, usually from people whose grasp on reality has been loosened by too much suffering or too much wine. "And what exactly do you propose to do that our armies have not already attempted?" Joan stands before him with a composure that seems far beyond her 17 years, her simple grey dress a stark contrast to the military splendour that surrounds her. When she speaks, her voice carries the quiet certainty that has become her trademark. "My lord, I am sent by my Lord God to tell you that you must send word to the Dauphin to hold himself ready, but not to give battle to his enemies at this time. For my lord will give him help after mid-Lent. The kingdom does not belong to the Dauphin, but to my lord. However, my lord wills that the Dauphin shall be made king and shall hold the kingdom in trust." The specificity of her words, the confidence with which she speaks of divine plans and royal destinies, gives Baudricourt pause. This is not the rambling of a village madwoman, but something more coherent, more troubling in its implications. Still, the practical soldier in him cannot accept such extraordinary claims without proof. "Words are easy to speak," he responds carefully. "If God has truly sent you, then surely he has given you some sign, some token that would convince reasonable men of your divine commission." Joan's reply comes without hesitation, as if she has been preparing for this question throughout her journey. "The sign will be the relief of Orléans and the coronation of the Dauphin at Reims. These things will come to pass exactly as I have told you. But first, you must provide me with men and arms to reach the court at Chinon." Baudricourt dismisses her, though not unkindly. He advises her to return to her father, to forget these dangerous fancies, to accept the life of a peasant woman that God has apparently chosen for her. But Joan does not return to Domrémy. Instead, she remains in Vaucouleurs, lodging with Henri and Catherine Le Royer, a wheelwright and his wife, who are moved by something in the girl's manner to offer her shelter. Day after day, Joan returns to Baudricourt's hall, repeating her message with unwavering consistency. She tells him of the desperate situation in Orléans, of the need for immediate action, of the divine plan that requires only human cooperation to unfold. Her persistence, combined with the growing respect she wins from the common soldiers and townspeople, begins to wear down his resistance. For there is something about Joan that affects everyone who meets her. The soldiers find themselves standing straighter in her presence, speaking more carefully, thinking more clearly about their duty to France. The townspeople seek her out for advice, for comfort, for the simple pleasure of being near someone who radiates such certainty and peace. Children follow her through the streets, not because she gives them sweets or tells them stories, but because she somehow makes the world seem safer, more purposeful, more touched by grace. Word of the strange girl who claims to be sent by God spreads beyond Vaucouleurs. Visitors come to see her, some seeking entertainment, others hoping for miracles, still others drawn by curiosity about someone who speaks with such confidence about divine plans. Among these visitors is Jean de Metz, a young knight who arrives skeptical and leaves convinced that he has met someone extraordinary. "When do you expect to set out for the Dauphin?" he asks Joan during one of their conversations, his question carrying both challenge and genuine interest. "Rather now than tomorrow, and rather tomorrow than later," Joan replies, her words revealing both urgency and patience. "I must be at the king's side by mid-Lent, for no one in the world, neither kings nor dukes nor the daughter of the King of Scotland, can restore the kingdom of France, save only myself. Though I would rather remain spinning beside my poor mother, this work has been laid upon me by my lord, and I must accomplish it." The mention of the daughter of the King of Scotland, a reference to Margaret of Scotland, who had been proposed as a possible bride for the Dauphin, shows that Joan's knowledge extends beyond the simple peasant girl she appears to be. Her intelligence, combined with her obvious sincerity, begins to convince even hardened skeptics that something genuinely unusual is taking place. Meanwhile, news from the wider war grows increasingly desperate. Orléans, the key to controlling the Loire Valley and the approaches to the Dauphin's territory, is indeed under siege by the English. The great fortress of Les Tourelles, which guards the bridge approach to the city, has fallen to the enemy. Food and supplies are running low within the city walls, and there are whispers that surrender may be inevitable. It is this news, perhaps more than Joan's persistent requests, that finally moves Baudricourt to action. In February of 1429, he makes the decision that will change the course of history. Whether moved by desperation, by growing belief in Joan's mission, or simply by the recognition that conventional approaches to the war have failed, he agrees to provide her with the men and supplies needed to reach the Dauphin's court. The transformation in Joan's status is immediate and dramatic. No longer a persistent petitioner haunting the captain's hall, she becomes the focus of intense preparation for a dangerous journey through territory contested by French and English forces. A small escort is assembled: Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, two knights who have come to believe in her mission; Collet de Vienne, a royal messenger who can provide guidance through the complex politics of the court; and two servants, Julian and Jean de Honnecourt. Joan is provided with a man's clothing for the journey, practical garments that will allow her to travel more safely and comfortably than would be possible in women's dress. The transformation is striking. Dressed as a young man, with her hair cut short and her bearing naturally confident, she looks every inch the part of a young knight setting out on a holy mission. The departure from Vaucouleurs takes place in the pre-dawn darkness of late February, with only a small group of well-wishers present to see them off. Baudricourt himself comes to bid Joan farewell, and his parting words carry both blessing and warning. "Go," he tells her, his gruff voice betraying an emotion he rarely allows himself to show. "And let come what may." The journey to Chinon stretches across 300 miles of dangerous territory, much of it controlled by English forces or plagued by brigands who prey on travellers foolish enough to venture far from fortified towns. The little party travels mostly at night, sleeping in hidden camps during the day, guided by Collet de Vienne's knowledge of safe routes and friendly houses where they can find shelter. Joan endures the hardships of the journey with a resilience that amazes her companions. She sleeps on the hard ground without complaint, eats whatever food they can find, and maintains a cheerfulness that seems unaffected by danger or discomfort. More remarkable still, she displays an almost supernatural ability to sense when they are approaching danger, guiding them away from English patrols with an instinct that seems to come from beyond ordinary human perception. During the long hours of night travel, as their horses pick their way carefully along muddy roads and through dark forests, Joan speaks to her companions about her mission with a clarity and conviction that gradually wins their complete devotion. She describes her visions not as mystical experiences beyond human understanding, but as practical communications from heaven about the urgent business of saving France. "God does not ask us to do impossible things," she explains to Jean de Metz as they rest their horses beside a stream that runs silver in the moonlight. "He asks us to do necessary things that seem impossible only because we have forgotten how to have faith. The English can be defeated because God wills it. The Dauphin can be crowned because that is the divine plan. Orléans can be relieved because that is why I have been sent." Her certainty becomes contagious. By the time they approach the Loire Valley and see in the distance the towers of Chinon Castle rising above the river like a promise of sanctuary, every member of her escort has become not just her protector, but her devoted follower. They have witnessed her courage, her intelligence, her unwavering faith, and they have come to believe that they are accompanying someone who has indeed been chosen by God for a great purpose. The castle of Chinon impresses even from a distance, a massive fortress perched on a rocky promontory above the Vienne River, its walls and towers speaking of centuries of royal power and military might. This is where the court of the Dauphin Charles has taken refuge, where the remnants of French nobility gather to debate strategy and mourn the losses that have brought their kingdom to the brink of extinction. But gaining access to the Dauphin proves almost as difficult as reaching Chinon itself. The court is filled with advisers who view Joan's arrival with suspicion, courtiers who see her claims as either dangerous delusion or clever fraud. For 2 days she waits in the town below the castle while messages pass back and forth, while debates rage in the council chamber about whether to grant audience to a peasant girl who claims divine commission. It is Yolande of Aragon, the Dauphin's mother-in-law and one of the most powerful women in France, who finally tips the balance in Joan's favor. perhaps recognizing in the girl something that reminds her of her own determination to see Charles crowned, perhaps simply curious about someone who has travelled so far on such an extraordinary mission. She persuades the hesitant Dauphin to grant Joan an audience. The great hall of Chinon Castle on the evening of March 8, 1429, becomes the stage for one of the most remarkable scenes in medieval history. More than 300 courtiers, nobles and officials crowd the vast chamber, their rich clothing and glittering jewellery creating a sea of colour beneath the flickering light of countless candles. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that seems almost to disappear into the shadows, sits the Dauphin Charles, or does he? For this is the famous test that has become legend. To see if Joan can identify the true Dauphin among his courtiers, Charles has arranged for another man to sit on the throne while he himself mingles anonymously among the crowd. It is a test designed to expose fraud or confirm divine guidance, and every eye in the hall watches Joan as she enters and looks around the magnificent chamber. She pauses for only a moment, her gaze sweeping across the assembled nobility with the confidence of someone who knows exactly what she is looking for. Then, without hesitation, she walks directly to where Charles stands among his courtiers, drops to one knee before him, and speaks words that will echo through history. God give you good life, gentle Dauphin. The impact is immediate and electric. Charles, stunned that she has identified him so easily, tries to deflect her attention toward the man on the throne. "I am not the king," he says, his voice betraying both amazement and uncertainty. "There is the king." But Joan is not to be misled. "In God's name, gentle prince, it is you who are the king, and no other." Her words carry such conviction that murmurs of amazement ripple through the assembled court. This peasant girl has just accomplished what should have been impossible for someone meeting the Dauphin for the first time. Charles, shaken by what he has witnessed, withdraws with Joan to a private chamber where they can speak without the curious ears of the court. What passes between them during this conversation remains one of history's great mysteries, but its effects are unmistakable. Joan later claims that she revealed to Charles a secret sign, known only to him and to God, that proved beyond doubt the divine nature of her mission. Whatever she tells him, it transforms the hesitant, self-doubting prince into someone capable of decisive action. When they emerge from their private conference, Charles announces to his astonished court that he has decided to entrust Joan with military command and provide her with whatever forces she needs to attempt the relief of Orléans. The news spreads through the castle like wildfire, creating excitement, confusion, and no small amount of alarm. Some courtiers are thrilled by the prospect of divine intervention in France's desperate struggle. Others worry that the Dauphin has lost his mind, that he is placing the fate of the kingdom in the hands of a deluded peasant girl. Still others wonder if Joan might be a witch or an agent of France's enemies, sent to lead them to destruction. But Charles has made his decision, and despite all his weaknesses and hesitations, he is still the heir to the throne of France. Orders go out for the assembly of an army, for the preparation of supplies, for the forging of armor that will fit Joan's slender frame. The peasant girl from Domrémy is to be given what no woman in the history of France has ever possessed: command of royal forces in time of war. As word of these developments spreads beyond Chinon, as messengers carry the news to every corner of France still loyal to the Dauphin, the response is immediate and dramatic. In villages and towns throughout the kingdom, people speak in hushed, wondering voices of the Maid who has come to save France. Some call her a saint, others a sorceress, but all recognize that something unprecedented is taking place. The girl who left Domrémy as Joan the peasant has become Jeanne la Pucelle, Joan the Maid, and the world holds its breath to see whether divine providence or human folly will determine what happens next. In the castle of Chinon, as preparations begin for the campaign that will either validate Joan's extraordinary claims or end in catastrophic defeat, the course of history balances on the edge of a sword that has yet to be drawn. The ancient city of Orléans rises from the Loire River like a prayer made of stone, its towers and spires reaching toward heaven, while its walls speak of earthly determination to endure. For 6 months now, those walls have been tested by the greatest siege engines the English can bring to bear, and still they stand. Still they shelter the 40,000 souls who have made this city their fortress against the tide of conquest that threatens to sweep away the last vestiges of French independence. From the battlements of Orléans, the besieged defenders can see the English fortifications that ring their city like a chain of iron. Massive earthworks and wooden palisades, siege towers that loom against the sky, and the great fortress of Les Tourelles, once the guardian of the southern bridge approach to the city, now turned against its former protectors. The sight would be enough to break the spirit of any ordinary garrison. But the people of Orléans are sustained by something more than ordinary hope. They have heard the rumors, the whispers that spread through France like ripples on water, stories of a maid sent by God to lift the siege, to crown the Dauphin, to drive the English back across the sea from whence they came. Some dismiss these tales as wishful thinking, the kind of desperate fantasies that arise when reality becomes too painful to bear. But others find in them the strength to continue their resistance, to hold out just a little longer, to believe that deliverance might yet come from an unexpected source. Joan arrives at the outskirts of Orléans on April 29th, 1429, at the head of a relief force that is smaller than anyone hoped, but larger than anyone dared expect just weeks before. News of her mission has spread throughout France, drawing volunteers from every corner of the kingdom still loyal to the Dauphin. Knights and men-at-arms, archers and crossbowmen, peasants armed with nothing but farm tools and burning conviction. They have come because they believe, or because they hope, or simply because Joan's call to service has awakened something in them that seemed dead. The sight of Orléans under siege would daunt the most experienced military commander. The English positions are formidable, scientifically planned, supplied with the latest artillery. Their commanders, the Earl of Suffolk, Lord Talbot, Sir John Fastolf, are veterans of decades of French campaigns, men who have turned siege warfare into a precise art. Their strategy is simple and effective. Starve the city into submission while preventing any relief force from breaking through their lines. But Joan surveys the English positions with the eyes of someone who sees not just military obstacles, but divine opportunity. To her companion's amazement, she shows no dismay at the strength of the enemy fortifications, no concern about the disparity in numbers between her relief force and the besieging army. Instead, she speaks with calm confidence about the methods by which Orléans will be liberated. God did not bring me so far to fail now, she tells the Count of Dunois, the gallant defender of Orléans who has ridden out to meet her forces. The English will raise their siege and depart. Some will go willingly, others will be driven, but all will go. This I promise you on the word of the King of Heaven. Her certainty proves contagious among both her own forces and the defenders of Orléans. When she rides into the city that evening, her white banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary streaming behind her, the welcome she receives is unlike anything in the city's long history. People line the streets, weeping with joy, reaching out to touch her horse, her armor, even the hem of her banner. They see in her not just a military commander, but a living symbol of divine intervention, proof that God has not abandoned France in its hour of greatest need. The transformation in the city's atmosphere is immediate and remarkable. Where before there had been grim determination mixed with growing despair, now there is exultation, confidence, eagerness for battle. Soldiers who had been conserving their strength for a long siege now speak of taking the fight to the enemy. Citizens who had been hoarding their last stores of food now open their doors to feed Joan's men. The city that had been slowly dying under siege suddenly pulses with renewed life. Joan establishes her headquarters in the house of Jacques Boucher, treasurer of the Duke of Orléans, where she meets with the military commanders to plan the relief of the siege. The council of war that follows reveals the strategic genius that divine inspiration has awakened in the peasant girl from Domrémy. She listens carefully to detailed reports about English positions, studies maps and diagrams, asks penetrating questions about supply lines and defensive weaknesses. But when the time comes for decision, Joan's plan is simpler and bolder than anything her experienced officers had envisioned. Rather than attempting the slow, careful approach that conventional military wisdom would dictate, she proposes a series of direct assaults on the English fortifications, beginning with the strongest positions and working systematically around the siege lines until the enemy is forced to withdraw. God did not send me here to conduct a cautious campaign, she explains to the assembled commanders, her voice carrying the authority that has become her trademark. The English hold their positions through fear and the belief that they cannot be defeated. Once we show them otherwise, once we prove that divine will is stronger than human arms, their confidence will crumble faster than their fortifications. The first test comes on May 4th, with an assault on the English fortress of Les Tourelles. This massive stone structure controls the bridge approach to Orléans and represents the key to the entire siege. If it can be recaptured, the English position becomes untenable. If the assault fails, Joan's credibility and the city's hope will both be shattered. The attack begins at dawn, with Joan herself in the forefront, her white banner marking her position for both friend and foe. She wears armor specially crafted for her slight frame, its polished steel catching the early morning light like captured fire. In her hand, she carries not a sword. she has declared she will shed no blood in this holy war, but a banner that has become the symbol of French resistance. The sight of her advancing fearlessly toward the strongest English position electrifies her soldiers and terrifies her enemies. Here is a woman, and her gender is no secret, despite her armor, leading men into battle with the confidence of someone who knows the outcome has already been determined by heaven. The psychological impact is devastating to English morale and inspiring beyond measure to the French. The assault on Les Tourelles becomes a battle of such ferocity that it echoes through the ages as one of the great military engagements of the medieval period. For hours, French soldiers hurl themselves against the fortress walls, while English defenders pour down arrows, boiling oil, and stones from the battlements. The air fills with smoke and dust, with the clash of steel and the cries of wounded men, with the sound of siege engines and the crash of falling masonry. Joan is everywhere at once, encouraging wavering soldiers, directing the placement of ladders, calling upon the saints to strengthen French arms. When an English arrow strikes her shoulder, driving deep into the joint between her armor plates, she pulls it out with her own hands and continues fighting, her blood-stained banner still flying above the melee. The turning point comes when Joan, despite her wound, leads a final charge against the fortress gate. Her example inspires such courage in her followers that they overwhelm the English defences through sheer determination and faith. Les Tourelles falls, its English garrison either killed or captured, its strategic position now turned against the besiegers. The liberation of Les Tourelles breaks the back of the English siege. Over the following days, Joan leads assault after assault against the remaining English positions, each victory making the next one easier as English confidence crumbles and French morale soars to unprecedented heights. The psychological warfare proves even more effective than the physical combat. English soldiers, faced with an enemy who seems protected by divine power, begin to abandon their positions even before they are attacked. The final morning of the siege dawns clear and bright, with the sounds of English withdrawal echoing across the Loire Valley. Carts loaded with supplies and equipment stream away from the abandoned siege works, while columns of soldiers march northward in formations that speak more of retreat than tactical redeployment. The great Siege of Orléans, which had threatened to deliver all of southern France into English hands, ends not in the fall of the city, but in the flight of its besiegers. Joan watches the English departure from the walls of Orléans, her wounded arm in a sling, but her spirit soaring with triumph. Around her, the citizens of the city celebrate with tears of joy, prayers of thanksgiving, and songs of victory that will be remembered for generations. Church bells ring out across the city, their bronze voices carrying news of deliverance to every corner of the Loire Valley. But even in the moment of triumph, Joan's thoughts are already turning toward the larger mission that brought her to Orléans. The siege has been lifted, just as her heavenly voices promised, but this is only the beginning. The Dauphin must still be crowned, the English must still be driven from French soil, and the kingdom must still be restored to its rightful place among the nations of Christendom. "This is the sign I promised," she tells the Count of Dunois, as they stand together, watching the last English banners disappear beyond the horizon. Now we must move quickly to complete what God has begun. The road to Reims lies open, and Charles must be crowned before our enemies can recover from this defeat. The Maid of Orléans has become Joan the Victorious, and across France the news of her triumph spreads like wildfire through a drought-stricken land. In village churches, priests offer masses of thanksgiving. In taverns and market squares, people speak in wondering voices of miracles and divine intervention. In the castles of the nobility, lords who had been preparing to submit to English rule now dust off their banners and sharpen their swords, ready to fight again for a kingdom they had thought lost forever. The girl who had left Domrémy with nothing but visions and faith has proven that heaven's power can indeed work through mortal hands. The Siege of Orléans is over, but the legend of Joan of Arc has only just begun to unfold, and France itself stands on the threshold of a rebirth that will echo through the centuries to come. The road from Orléans to Reims stretches across the heart of France like a prayer made manifest in stone and earth, winding through valleys where vineyards climb hillsides toward heaven, and past villages that have waited generations for the sound of French victory bells. Joan rides at the head of an army transformed, no longer the desperate collection of volunteers who had gathered to relieve a besieged city, but a force united by triumph and animated by the growing conviction that they follow someone touched by divine grace. The countryside through which they pass tells the story of France's long agony and sudden hope. Here are fields returning to cultivation after years of abandonment. There are villages rebuilding walls that war had torn down. The people who line the roads to watch the army pass show faces that have remembered how to smile. Children who wave banners hastily sewn from scraps of cloth. Old men who weep to see French soldiers marching not in retreat, but in confident advance toward an objective that has seemed impossible for so long. News of the victory at Orléans has spread across Europe like ripples from a stone, cast into still water. In London, the English court receives reports of the siege's failure with disbelief that quickly turns to alarm. How could their veteran commanders, their tested strategies, their superior positions be defeated by a peasant girl and a ragged army of French rebels? In Rome, the Pope himself takes notice of events in France, wondering whether divine intervention has indeed manifested itself in the form of this extraordinary young woman. But it is in France itself that the impact proves most profound. Towns that had submitted to English rule suddenly find reasons to reconsider their allegiance. Noble families who had been hedging their bets between French and English claims now openly declare for the Dauphin. Most significantly, the great cities along the route to Reims, Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency, open their gates to Joan's advancing army without resistance, their English garrisons either fleeing or surrendering rather than face the Maid who has proven that the English can be defeated. The march becomes a triumphal procession unlike anything seen in France for generations. At each town and village, Joan is greeted not merely as a military commander, but as a liberator, a saint, a living symbol of French resurgence. People bring their sick children for her to bless, their family treasures for her to touch, their fears and hopes for her to carry to the throne of heaven. She accepts these tributes with the same calm grace that has marked all her actions, never claiming miraculous powers, yet never denying the divine source of her mission. Among her followers, the conviction grows that they are witnessing something unprecedented in human history. Veteran soldiers speak in awed voices of how arrows seem to turn aside from Joan's body, how her presence fills even the most cowardly with courage, how her prayers before battle are followed invariably by victory. Priests attached to the army report that attendance at Mass has never been higher, that confessions are heard at all hours, that the entire force seems to have taken on the character of a religious pilgrimage as much as a military campaign. Joan herself remains focused on the practical necessities of her mission. She consults constantly with her commanders about routes and supplies, sends scouts ahead to gather intelligence about English movements, maintains discipline among her forces with a combination of maternal care and stern authority that proves remarkably effective. Yet those closest to her notice that she often falls silent during the march, her eyes taking on the distant look that signals communication with her heavenly guides. "They tell me we must move quickly," she confides to the Duke of Alençon as they ride through the ancient forest of Compiègne, sunlight filtering through leaves that dance in the summer breeze. The English are gathering their forces for a great counterattack, but if Charles can be crowned before they are ready, if the sacred oils of Reims can consecrate his kingship, then no earthly power will be able to challenge his legitimacy. The political significance of the coronation at Reims cannot be overstated. For nearly 8 centuries, French kings have received their crowns in the great cathedral of that city, where Saint-Rémy baptized Clovis and established the sacred tradition that makes French monarchy more than mere political authority. The holy oils used in the ceremony are believed to have been brought by an angel for Clovis's baptism, making each anointed king not just a ruler, but a partner in divine governance. Charles himself, still calling himself Dauphin, despite his growing confidence, joins the advancing army with a court that has been transformed by recent events. Gone is the atmosphere of desperate improvisation that had characterized his exile. In its place, there is the measured dignity of a royal progress, the ceremonial preparation for an event that will change the balance of power in medieval Europe. Lords who had been reluctant to commit themselves fully to his cause now compete for the honor of serving in the coronation ceremony. The approach to Reims reveals the city in all its Gothic splendor, the cathedral's twin towers rising like prayers made stone, the royal palace where Charlemagne once held court, the ancient walls that have witnessed the crowning of kings since time immemorial. But it is the cathedral itself that draws every eye, its facade a masterpiece of medieval art, where stone saints seem to move in the shifting light, and the great rose window catches the sun like a fragment of heaven itself. The citizens of Reims welcome their king with celebrations that echo back through centuries of French tradition. Banners hang from every window, flowers carpet the streets, and the cathedral bells ring out in changes so complex and beautiful that they seem to voice the very joy of heaven itself. For these people, the arrival of Charles means not just the end of their city's uncomfortable neutrality, but the restoration of the natural order, the return of sacred kingship to its proper place. The night before the coronation, Joan keeps vigil in the cathedral, kneeling before the altar where tomorrow's ceremony will unfold. The vast space around her, lit only by scattered candles, creates an atmosphere of profound solemnity. Here, in this place, where kings have been made for 800 years, she prepares to witness the culmination of the mission that began with visions in her father's garden. Her prayer that night is overheard by several witnesses, and their accounts reveal both the depth of her faith and the burden she has carried since leaving Domrémy. "Lord God," she whispers in the cathedral darkness, "if it is truly your will that Charles be crowned here tomorrow, then let this ceremony mark not the end, but the beginning. Let his reign bring peace to France, justice to the poor, and strength to resist all who would destroy what you have ordained." The coronation dawns clear and bright, July 17th, 1429, a Sunday that will be remembered as long as France endures. The ceremony unfolds with all the ancient splendor that tradition requires: the procession of peers, the presentation of the sacred regalia, the anointing with oils that legend says were brought by angels. But everyone present knows that this coronation is different from all that came before, that the presence of Joan of Arc transforms a ritual into a miracle. She stands throughout the ceremony in a place of honor near the altar, her banner in her hands, her armor polished to mirror brightness beneath a surcoat bearing the arms of France. When Charles kneels to receive the crown, when the Archbishop of Reims pronounces the ancient words that make a prince into a king, Joan's face reflects a joy so intense that witnesses later say she seemed transformed, as if the light of heaven itself shone through her mortal features. The moment of crowning arrives with the weight of centuries behind it. As the crown of Charlemagne descends onto Charles's head, as the peers of France cry, "Montjoie, Saint-Denis," in the traditional acclamation, something shifts in the balance of the medieval world. The Dauphin Charles becomes King Charles VII of France, and his legitimacy is sealed not just by human ceremony, but by divine intervention made manifest through the Maid who stands beside his throne. Joan's response to the completion of her mission is characteristically humble and profound. When the newly crowned king attempts to honor her with titles and rewards, she asks only for the continued success of French arms and the swift liberation of all territories still under English occupation. "I have done what my lord commanded," she tells him quietly as the celebration continues around them. "Now your majesty must rule as he would have you rule, with justice and mercy and constant remembrance that your crown comes from heaven." The impact of the coronation reverberates far beyond the cathedral walls. News of Charles's crowning spreads across Europe with unprecedented speed, carried by merchants and pilgrims, by diplomats and spies, by the countless travelers who make medieval Europe a web of interconnected communication. In every court, in every chancellery, maps are redrawn and alliances reconsidered. France, which had seemed destined for partition between England and Burgundy, has suddenly reasserted itself as a sovereign power. But perhaps the most profound impact is felt by the common people of France, who hear in the cathedral bells of Reims the voice of their own liberation. Across the kingdom, in villages that have known only war and occupation, people speak of miracles and divine favor, of a maid sent by God to restore their rightful king. The psychological transformation is as important as any military victory. A people who had begun to accept defeat now remember what it means to hope. As the royal party prepares to leave Reims, as plans are made for the next phase of the campaign to complete the liberation of France, Joan takes one last look at the cathedral where her greatest triumph has been achieved. The building stands eternal and serene, its stones having witnessed this latest chapter in the long story of French kingship, its spires reaching toward heaven like the prayers of a grateful nation. The peasant girl from Domrémy has accomplished what seemed impossible. She has seen a king crowned and a kingdom restored to hope. But even in this moment of triumph, she knows that her mission is not yet complete. English armies still occupy French soil, and until every foreign banner is driven from the realm, until every French city can raise its head in freedom, the work that God has given her remains unfinished. The maid who lifted the Siege of Orléans has become the kingmaker of Reims, and France itself stands reborn beneath the summer sky, ready to reclaim its destiny among the nations of the earth. The summer of 1429 passes like a golden dream across the French countryside, each day bringing news of fresh victories, each week seeing English garrisons abandoned and French banners raised where foreign rule had seemed eternal. Joan rides from triumph to triumph, her white standard streaming in the warm air, her presence transforming every engagement from mere military action into something approaching miracle. Yet even as French forces sweep northward in a campaign of liberation that grows stronger with each success, shadows begin to gather around the edges of Joan's story. The very qualities that have made her so effective, her absolute faith, her divine certainty, her refusal to accept conventional limitations, also create tensions with the political realities of medieval warfare and the complex loyalties that govern noble society. The court that surrounds King Charles, transformed though it has been by recent events, remains a place where ambition and intrigue flow as constantly as blood through living veins. Men who have spent their lives maneuvering for advantage do not easily adapt to the simple directness that Joan brings to every situation. When she proposes to march immediately on Paris to complete the liberation of France before the English can recover their balance, she encounters for the first time sustained opposition from those who should be her strongest supporters. Georges de la Trémoille, the king's chief minister, speaks for the cautious voices in council when he argues that consolidation should take precedence over further conquest. "We have achieved more in 3 months than anyone dared hope," he reminds the assembled nobles, his words carrying the weight of experience and political calculation. "Perhaps it would be wiser to secure what we have gained rather than risk everything on another gamble." Joan's response reveals both her divine insight and her growing isolation from the practical concerns that motivate others. God didn't give us these victories so that we might sit idle and watch them slip away, she declares, her voice carrying the authority that has become her trademark. The English are weakened, confused, demoralized. Now is the time to strike, while heaven's favor still shines upon our arms. But the momentum that had seemed irresistible in the weeks following Reims begins to slow as political considerations assert themselves over military ones. The king himself, despite his gratitude to Joan and his genuine affection for the maid who made his crown possible, finds himself pulled between competing pressures. Some of his advisers speak of diplomatic solutions, of negotiations that might secure English to withdrawal without further bloodshed. Others worry about the cost of continued campaigning, about the strain on royal finances that an extended war would create. The first serious check to French arms comes at Compiègne in August, where Joan's assault on the English-held city meets with determined resistance. For the first time since Orléans, her forces are repelled, and the psychological impact proves as significant as the military setback. Soldiers who had begun to believe themselves invincible under Joan's leadership suddenly confront the possibility that even divine favor has its limits. Joan herself takes the defeat harder than anyone around her realizes. That night, in her tent beside the walls of Compiègne, she prays with an intensity that her companions find almost frightening. When morning comes, she emerges calm and determined, but those closest to her notice a change, a shadow in her eyes that had not been there before, a weight that seems to press upon her shoulders with increasing burden. "My voices warn me that I have little time left," she confides to her confessor, Father Pasquerel, as they ride away from the failed siege. "They tell me that before midsummer comes again, I will be taken by our enemies. But they also promise that this will not mean the end of our cause, only a change in how God chooses to work His will." The prophecy proves accurate in ways that even Joan could not have foreseen. As autumn advances toward winter, the political landscape of France begins to shift in ways that work against the simple clarity of her mission. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, whose alliance with England has been one of the strongest pillars of the English position in France, begins to consider the possibility of reconciliation with King Charles. The negotiations that follow are conducted in the shadowy world of medieval diplomacy, where promises are made and broken with equal facility, where today's enemy might become tomorrow's ally if sufficient advantage can be gained. Joan finds herself increasingly excluded from these discussions, her straightforward approach to questions of loyalty and honor seeming naive to men accustomed to the subtle calculations of power politics. The tension comes to a head during the Siege of Paris in September, when Joan leads an assault on the capital that has been held by the English for more than a decade. The attack is fierce and prolonged, with Joan herself in the forefront, as always, her banner marking the point of greatest danger. But this time, the divine protection that has seemed to surround her wavers. An English crossbow bolt pierces her leg just above the knee, dropping her in full view of both armies. The sight of the seemingly invincible maid falling, wounded, sends shockwaves through the French ranks and corresponding elation through the English defenders. Though Joan is quickly carried to safety and the wound proves not mortal, the psychological damage cannot be easily repaired. More damaging still is the king's response to the failed assault. Rather than allowing Joan to regroup and try again, Charles orders the siege to be lifted, the army to be withdrawn. His decision reflects not military necessity, but political calculation. The ongoing negotiations with Burgundy require a gesture of moderation, a demonstration that France seeks peace rather than total victory. Joan's protests fall on deaf ears, increasingly deafened by the complex requirements of statecraft. When she argues that God's will requires the complete liberation of France, she is told that God's will must be balanced against human prudence. When she insists that the English will never voluntarily surrender what they have taken by force, she is assured that diplomacy can accomplish what arms alone cannot achieve. The winter of 1429 to 1430 finds Joan in an increasingly isolated position. Officially, she retains her military command and the king's favour. In practice, she discovers that her counsel is sought less frequently. Her recommendations followed less consistently. Her presence required mainly for ceremonial purposes rather than strategic planning. The court that had once hung on her every word now treats her with the kind of respectful distance reserved for honoured guests who have perhaps stayed too long. Yet Joan continues to serve with the same dedication that has marked her mission from the beginning. She leads raids against English outposts, maintains the discipline and morale of her forces, and prepares for what her voices increasingly warn her will be her final campaign. When spring arrives and military operations resume, she throws herself into the fighting with an intensity that seems to burn brighter as the shadows around her deepen. The campaign of 1430 begins with mixed omens. French forces win several minor engagements, but the great breakthrough that Joan seeks continues to elude her grasp. The English, recovering from their earlier demoralization, fight with renewed determination under commanders who have learned to respect their unusual adversary. The Burgundians, still negotiating with both sides, maintain a careful neutrality that effectively supports English positions while appearing to remain open to French overtures. It is during this campaign that Joan makes the fateful decision to ride to the relief of Compiègne, the city whose walls had repelled her assault the previous summer. The town, still loyal to France, but increasingly isolated by Burgundian forces, has sent desperate appeals for help that touch something deep in Joan's heart. Perhaps she sees in Compiègne's situation a mirror of her own, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by those who should be allies, yet maintaining faith in the ultimate justice of the cause. The relief force that Joan assembles is smaller than she would like, but larger than the king's advisers think wise. Among her followers are men who have served with her since Orléans, soldiers whose loyalty to the Maid transcends their allegiance to any earthly lord. They follow her, not because they must, but because they believe in her mission, in her protection, in the rightness of the cause she has made their own. The march to Compiègne takes them through countryside that shows the mixed fortunes of the war's recent phases. Here are villages liberated during the triumphant advance of the previous year, their people prosperous and confident. There are towns that have changed hands multiple times, their walls scarred by repeated sieges, their inhabitants wary of committing themselves too fully to any side. And there are places where the tide of war has left only ruins, empty fields where families once lived and worked, broken bridges that no one has found the resources to repair. Joan rides at the head of her column with the same confidence that has marked all her campaigns, but those who know her best can see the strain of the past months in the set of her shoulders, the shadows under her eyes, the way her prayers seem longer and more intense than before. She speaks often now of sacrifice, of the necessity sometimes to give everything for a cause greater than oneself, of the honor that comes to those who die in service to God and France. "I do not know what will come of this campaign," she tells her squire, Jean d'Aulon, as they rest their horses beside a stream that runs clear and cold in the spring sunshine. "My voices speak to me still, but their words are different now, less of victory than of completion, less of triumph than of offering. I think perhaps my time as a warrior is drawing to an end, and my time as a witness is beginning." The approach to Compiègne reveals a city under severe pressure. Burgundian forces have established a tight siege, their banners flying defiantly from positions that command all the major approaches. The English, while not directly involved in the siege, have provided support and coordination that makes the Burgundian effort far more effective than it might otherwise have been. Most ominously, the siege lines are commanded by John of Luxembourg, a Burgundian noble whose skill in warfare equals his loyalty to his duke. Joan's plan for relieving the siege follows the pattern that has brought her success before: a bold, direct assault that will shatter enemy confidence while inspiring her own forces. But this time, the enemy is prepared for her tactics. This time, they have studied her methods, analyzed her weaknesses, positioned themselves to counter the very qualities that have made her so effective. The attack begins at dawn on May 23rd, 1430, with Joan leading a force of perhaps 400 men against Burgundian positions that shelter nearly 3 times that number. Her white banner streams in the morning breeze as she charges toward the enemy lines, her voice raised in the war cry that has become synonymous with French resurgence: "For God and France." For a moment, it seems as if the old magic will work again. The sight of Joan charging toward them causes wavering among the Burgundian ranks, and her initial assault breaks through their forward positions with the irresistible force that has characterized all her campaigns. French soldiers pour through the gap, driving toward the siege lines with the desperate courage of men fighting for a cause that transcends their own survival. But this time, the enemy has planned for Joan's success as well as her failure. As her forces advance, they find themselves drawn into a carefully prepared trap. Burgundian reserves emerge from concealed positions, cutting off the French retreat. The breakthrough that had seemed so promising becomes a deadly snare, from which there is no escape. Joan fights with desperate courage, trying to rally her scattered forces, attempting to cut her way back to safety. Her sword, the one found at the shrine of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois at the beginning of her mission, flashes in the morning light as she strikes down enemy after enemy. But human strength, however inspired by divine purpose, has its limits, and even Joan cannot overcome the mathematics of overwhelming numbers. The end comes suddenly, almost anticlimactically. A Burgundian archer named Lionel de Vendôme, later to be remembered as the man who changed the course of history with a single action, seizes Joan's surcoat and pulls her from her horse. She struggles fiercely, calling upon her saints for deliverance, but the press of enemy soldiers makes resistance futile. "I yield to you," she finally gasps, her voice carrying across the battlefield with shocking clarity. The words that follow will be debated by historians for centuries, whether she yields to John of Luxembourg specifically, whether she attempts to bargain for the safety of her men, whether she already foresees the fate that awaits her in enemy hands. The capture of Joan of Arc sends shockwaves across Europe that are felt as strongly as any military victory or defeat. In France, the news arrives like a physical blow, leaving even her enemies stunned by the implications. The maid who had seemed invincible, protected by divine favor, guided by heavenly voices, has been taken by mortal men using earthly tactics. In England, the reaction is complex, relief mixed with uncertainty about what to do with so dangerous a prisoner. She cannot simply be treated as an ordinary captive of war, for her influence extends far beyond military considerations. Yet neither can she be simply released or ransomed, for her freedom would restore hope to French resistance at the moment when English fortunes might finally be improving. The Burgundians who hold her face an equally complex decision. Duke Philip has political reasons to keep Joan from English hands, yet he cannot ignore the substantial ransom the English are prepared to pay. Most importantly, he recognizes that the maid's capture represents an opportunity to strike a decisive blow against French morale, but only if her fate is handled with careful attention to its symbolic significance. For Joan herself, captivity brings an unexpected relief from the burdens of command and the isolation of leadership. In her cell in the castle of Beaulieu, later in Beaurevoir, she finds a kind of peace that has eluded her since the early days of her mission. Here, surrounded by enemy guards but free from the constant demands of military and political decision-making, she can return to the simple practices of faith that have always been her true strength. Yet even in captivity, Joan remains dangerous to her enemies. Reports filter out of her prisons, stories of her continued visions, of her unwavering faith, of her insistence that God's plan for France will unfold regardless of her personal fate. These accounts, spreading through the networks of merchants and pilgrims, refugees and soldiers, keep alive the hope that her mission represents something larger than any individual life. The negotiations for her fate continue through the summer and into autumn of 1430. The English, led by Cardinal Beaufort, press for Joan's transfer to their custody for trial on charges of heresy and witchcraft. The Burgundians, while willing to cooperate for the right price, remain conscious of the political implications of appearing to betray a prisoner to foreign enemies. The French, despite their desperate desire to secure Joan's freedom, find themselves unable to match the financial and political incentives that the English can offer. In the end, money and politics triumph over loyalty and gratitude. In November 1430, Joan is sold to the English for 10,000 livres, a sum that represents both the extraordinary value her enemies place on her elimination and the callous calculation that reduces a human life to a matter of accounting. The transfer takes place on a cold November morning that seems to mark the end of one chapter in the story of France and the beginning of another, darker one. Joan, dressed in the simple clothing of a prisoner, is escorted under heavy guard from Burgundian to English custody. As her cart rolls through the gates of the castle where her captivity began, she looks back once at the French countryside that has been her home, her battleground, and her passion. The girl who changed history is now in the hands of those who are determined to unmake that change, to prove that her victories were achieved through supernatural means that Christian doctrine cannot accept. The stage is set for a confrontation that will pit human judgment against divine inspiration, earthly authority against heavenly commission, the power of the Church against the mystery of individual faith. Behind Joan, the France she has served continues its slow recovery from generations of defeat and despair. Her capture has not erased the memory of Orléans or the legitimacy of Charles VII's crown. The English still face an awakened nation, a people who have remembered what it means to hope. The tide that Joan helped to turn will continue to flow, carrying France toward a destiny that no earthly power can ultimately prevent. The castle of Rouen rises from the Norman countryside like a monument to English power in France, its massive walls and towers speaking of centuries of dominance over this ancient duchy that was once the heart of a Norman empire stretching from Scotland to Sicily. In the winter of 1430, those stones will witness events that echo through history, the trial of a peasant girl whose brief career has shaken the foundations of the medieval world. Joan's journey from Burgundian captivity to English imprisonment passes through landscapes that tell the story of a war-torn realm. The roads are rutted and dangerous, patrolled by soldiers whose loyalties shift with the fortunes of battle. Villages huddle behind their walls, their inhabitants peering nervously at any group of armed travelers, uncertain whether they bring deliverance or destruction. It is a world where authority comes from force rather than law, where survival depends on reading correctly the intentions of those who hold power. The English who escort Joan to Rouen treat her with the careful respect due to a dangerous enemy. They have heard the stories of arrows that turn aside from her body, of soldiers who find courage simply by fighting beside her, of victories achieved against impossible odds. Whether they believe these tales or not, they are taking no chances with a prisoner whose reputation for supernatural protection makes even hardened veterans nervous. Joan herself endures the journey with the patience that has become her hallmark in captivity. Dressed in the grey tunic and hose of a male prisoner, clothing that her captors require both for practical reasons and to support the charges they intend to bring against her, she maintains the dignity that no earthly authority can take from her. When her guards speak to her, she responds with courtesy but without subservience. When they attempt to engage her in conversation about her mission, she answers with the same directness that has characterized all her interactions with authority. "You believe you are taking me to trial," she tells the English captain, responsible for her escort as they approach the walls of Rouen. "But God sees all things, and His justice will prevail regardless of what men may plan. I have served the King of Heaven faithfully, and He will not abandon me in my hour of greatest need." Her words carry such conviction that even her captors find themselves moved, though they dare not show it. These are professional soldiers, men accustomed to the harsh realities of medieval warfare, yet there is something about their prisoner that makes them uncomfortable. She speaks of divine will with the certainty that others reserve for discussing the weather, and her calm acceptance of whatever fate awaits her in Rouen seems to come from a source beyond ordinary human courage. The city of Rouen itself bears witness to the complex loyalties that divide France in this period of civil war and foreign occupation. Officially, it is the capital of English France, the seat of the young King Henry VI's government in his claimed French territories. The English administrators who run the city have worked hard to create an impression of legitimacy, of settled authority that represents the natural order rather than foreign conquest. Yet beneath this official facade, currents of resistance flow as persistently as the Seine River that curves through the heart of the city. In taverns and workshops, in churches and markets, the people of Rouen speak in whispers of the maid who lifted the Siege of Orléans and crowned their rightful king at Reims. Her capture has not eliminated the hope she represents, but rather transformed it into something more dangerous to her enemies, the expectation of martyrdom that can inspire resistance long after the original inspiration has been silenced. The English authorities understand this dynamic perfectly, which explains the careful planning that has gone into Joan's trial. This cannot be a simple military tribunal dealing with a prisoner of war. It must be a religious proceeding that proves conclusively that her victories were achieved through demonic rather than divine assistance, that her visions were delusions or deceptions, that following her example leads not to salvation but to damnation. The man chosen to lead this spiritual assault on Joan's reputation is Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, whose career has been built on serving English interests in France. Learned, ambitious, and utterly convinced that English rule represents God's will for France, Cauchon brings to his task both the authority of the Church and the political sophistication necessary to construct a case that will satisfy both theological and practical requirements. Cauchon's preparations are meticulous. He assembles a court of theologians and legal experts drawn from the University of Paris, that great centre of medieval learning that has sided with the English cause. He studies every available account of Joan's career, looking for contradictions, inconsistencies, or behaviours that can be interpreted as evidence of heretical beliefs. Most importantly, he constructs a legal framework that will make Joan's condemnation virtually inevitable, regardless of how skillfully she defends herself. Joan's first appearance before this tribunal takes place in the chapel of Rouen Castle on February 21st, 1431. The setting is carefully chosen to emphasize the religious nature of the proceedings while also demonstrating English authority. Banners bearing the leopards of England hang beside religious images, creating a visual reminder that in this place earthly and spiritual power work in harmony to serve the same cause. The young woman who stands before her judges bears little resemblance to the armoured warrior who charged the walls of Les Tourelles. Prison has taken its toll. She is thinner, paler, marked by the strain of months in captivity. Yet her bearing remains erect, her voice clear and strong, her gaze direct and unafraid. When asked to swear an oath to tell the truth about everything she will be questioned about, her response reveals both her intelligence and her understanding of the trap being set for her. "I do not know what you will ask me about," she says, her voice carrying across the chapel with remarkable clarity. "You might ask me things that I will not tell you." When pressed to take an absolute oath, she compromises with characteristic precision. "I will swear to tell you the truth about matters concerning the faith, but about my revelations I have never told anyone except King Charles." This response establishes the pattern that will define the entire trial. Joan consistently demonstrates her respect for the Church's authority, while refusing to betray the confidential aspects of her divine mission. She shows herself to be far more sophisticated than her humble origins would suggest, yet never abandons the simple faith that has sustained her throughout her extraordinary career. The questioning that follows reveals both the scope of her judge's ambitions and the depth of her own theological understanding. They probe every aspect of her story, her childhood visions, her journey to Chinon, her military campaigns, her claims of divine guidance. Each question is carefully crafted to elicit responses that can be interpreted as evidence of heresy, witchcraft, or delusion. Yet Joan's answers consistently frustrate their purposes. When asked about her saints, she describes them with such devotion and accuracy that even her enemies cannot find fault with her orthodoxy. When questioned about her male clothing, she explains the practical necessities that required this choice, while maintaining that she acted always under divine guidance. When challenged about her certainty regarding her own salvation, she responds with theological sophistication that amazes learned doctors. "If I am not in God's grace, may He put me there. If I am, may He keep me there." The political implications of the trial extend far beyond the fate of a single prisoner. Across France, people follow the proceedings with intense interest, receiving news through the networks of trade and pilgrimage that connect even remote villages to the great events of their time. Joan's steadfast defense of her mission, her unwavering faith in the face of intimidation and manipulation, transforms her from a military leader into something far more dangerous to English interests, a symbol of French resistance that grows stronger with each day of testimony. In the English court, administrators watch the trial's progress with growing concern. The proceedings that were supposed to destroy Joan's reputation seem instead to be confirming her status as a martyr. Reports from Rouen describe a young woman whose courage and faith shine brighter under persecution, whose simple honesty makes her learned interrogators appear petty and vindictive by comparison. Most troubling of all, from the English perspective, is the impact the trial is having on their own supporters. Burgundian nobles who had been content to serve English interests begin to question whether they are on the right side of a conflict that pits the power of the Church against an individual conscience guided by direct divine revelation. Even within the English administration, there are those who wonder whether Joan's condemnation will ultimately serve their cause or provide their enemies with a rallying point that will prove more dangerous than her living presence ever was. Joan herself seems to understand these broader implications perfectly. In her cell between sessions of questioning, she prays with the intensity that has marked her spiritual life since childhood. Yet her prayers now focus less on personal deliverance than on the welfare of France and the ultimate triumph of the cause she has served. She speaks often to her guards, when they are willing to listen, about the need for peace between Christian nations, about the sin of those who make war for personal gain rather than divine glory. As winter gives way to spring in the year 1431, the trial approaches its inevitable conclusion. The judges have gathered their evidence, constructed their arguments, prepared their verdict. Yet they have also, perhaps without fully realizing it, provided Joan with a platform from which her voice can reach across Europe and down through the centuries. The peasant girl from Domrémy has become something her enemies never anticipated, a teacher whose lessons about faith and courage will outlive all the kingdoms and empires that seek to silence her. The dungeons of Rouen castle echo with the sound of prayer in the hours before dawn, as Joan prepares for whatever fate awaits her. But in villages across France, church bells are beginning to ring, calling the faithful to Mass and to remembrance of all those who have died in service to truth. The maid who changed history is about to teach her final lesson about the power of individual faith to challenge even the mightiest earthly authorities. The chapel of Rouen Castle, on this cold March morning, seems caught between earth and heaven, its Gothic arches reaching toward God, while its stones remain firmly planted in the realm of human ambition and political calculation. Here, in this space, where sacred and secular authority intertwine, like the carved vines that decorate the pillars, Joan of Arc faces her final examination not as a prisoner of war, but as a soul whose very salvation hangs in the balance. The theological machinery assembled to judge her represents the finest legal and religious minds that money and political influence can gather. 63 assessors, drawn from the University of Paris and the ecclesiastical courts of France, sit in judgment with the weight of centuries of church law behind their deliberations. At their head, Pierre Cochon presides with the authority of a bishop and the determination of a man whose career depends upon delivering the verdict his English masters require. Yet for all their learning and authority, these judges find themselves confronting something that their education has not prepared them to understand. Joan appears before them each day with a composure that seems to come from beyond human sources, answering their most complex theological questions with a directness that cuts through layers of academic sophistication to reach the heart of divine truth. The questioning resumes with renewed intensity as the court seeks to trap Joan in contradictions that will justify the verdict they have already determined to reach. Dr. Jean Beaupère, one of the most skilled interrogators in the assembly, leads her through a labyrinth of inquiries about her visions, her voices, her understanding of church authority, and divine revelation. "Tell us," Beaupère demands, his voice carrying the weight of scholarly authority, "how do you know that these apparitions you claim to have seen come from God rather than from the devil? Cannot Satan himself appear as an angel of light to deceive the faithful?" Joan's response reveals both her theological sophistication and her unshakable certainty. "I know they come from God because they have led me to serve Him better, to love Him more perfectly, to sacrifice myself for His glory and the good of Christian souls. The devil might promise worldly rewards, but he would never command someone to give up everything earthly for the salvation of others." The logic is flawless, the theology orthodox, yet the judges press on, seeking some crack in her armor of faith. They question her about her assumption of male clothing, her participation in warfare, her claims to prophetic knowledge. Each line of inquiry is designed to reveal evidence of pride, of presumption, of the kind of spiritual arrogance that the Church condemns as heretical. But Joan meets each challenge with responses that demonstrate both humility and unwavering conviction. When accused of pride in claiming divine guidance, she responds, "If I am proud, may God humble me. If I am not in His grace, may He put me there. I would rather die than commit the sins that would separate my soul from God." When challenged about her refusal to submit unconditionally to church authority, she makes careful distinctions that reveal her understanding of the complex relationship between institutional power and divine truth. The proceedings reveal not just Joan's theological acumen, but also the political pressures that drive her prosecution. Questions about her loyalty to the Pope, who remains neutral in the French-English conflict, are clearly designed to create grounds for charges of schism. Inquiries about her prophecies concerning the English withdrawal from France serve to establish her as a political threat as much as a religious one. Most revealing of all are the questions about her sacred mission and her certainty regarding its divine origin. The judges cannot deny that her victories at Orléans and her success in securing Charles VII's coronation suggest some form of supernatural assistance. Their challenge, therefore, is to prove that this assistance came from demonic rather than divine sources, a task that requires them to argue that God would never work through such an unconventional instrument as a peasant girl dressed in male clothing and leading armies into battle. Joan's defense of her mission demonstrates the same qualities that made her such an effective military leader: directness, courage, and an ability to see through complex situations to their essential elements. "You say that God cannot work through me because I am young, because I am a woman, because I am of humble birth," she responds to one particularly aggressive line of questioning. But did not our Lord choose fishermen as His apostles? Did He not reveal His birth first to shepherds rather than to kings? God's ways are not man's ways, and His wisdom appears as foolishness to those who judge by worldly standards. The trial's most dramatic moment comes when Joan is confronted with a device that reveals the depths of her enemy's desperation to secure her condemnation. Brought before what appears to be an instrument of torture, she is told that she must recant her claims about divine revelation or face physical torment designed to force the truth from her lips. Her response echoes through the centuries as one of the great statements of individual conscience confronting institutional power. "Truly, if you were to have me torn limb from limb, I would tell you nothing different from what I have already said. And if I did say something different, I would always maintain afterward that you had forced me to speak against the truth." The courage displayed in this moment transcends any earthly consideration of pain or survival. Here is a young woman, barely 19 years old, facing the assembled power of church and state with nothing but her faith as armor, nothing but her certainty as a weapon. The contrast between her simple honesty and the complex machinations of her prosecutors reveals the essential nature of the conflict being played out in this Norman chapel. As the formal proceedings draw toward their conclusion, the judges find themselves in the uncomfortable position of having failed to achieve their primary objective. They have not succeeded in proving Joan's guilt of heresy or witchcraft. Instead, they have provided her with a platform from which her faith, courage, and theological understanding have shone forth for all Europe to see. The peasant girl has outmaneuvered the learned doctors, not through cleverness, but through the simple expedient of telling the truth. Yet the political necessities that drive the trial remain unchanged. The English must have Joan's condemnation, not because justice requires it, but because their position in France depends upon discrediting the divine authority she claims. The solution they devise reveals both their legal ingenuity and their moral bankruptcy, a conditional recantation that saves Joan's life while destroying her reputation. The scene in the cemetery of Saint-Ouen on May 24, 1431, represents one of history's most complex confrontations between individual conscience and institutional authority. Joan, brought before a vast crowd that includes both supporters and enemies, faces a choice that seems to offer no acceptable alternatives. She can maintain her claims about divine revelation and face immediate execution as a relapsed heretic, or she can sign a document that essentially admits she has been deluded about God's purpose for her life. The pressure brought to bear upon her in this moment transcends anything she has previously experienced. Not just her life, but her eternal salvation, as understood by the religious authorities of her time, hangs in the balance. The crowd that surrounds her includes people who have believed in her mission, who will see any recantation as confirmation that their faith was misplaced. Yet the alternative is immediate death with no opportunity to serve God further. In this moment of ultimate crisis, Joan makes a choice that reveals both her humanity and her continued trust in divine providence. She signs the document of abjuration, though whether she fully understands its contents remains a matter of historical debate. What is clear is that she hopes this compromise will allow her to continue serving God, perhaps in a contemplative, religious life that might still contribute to France's eventual liberation. The immediate aftermath of her recantation demonstrates the futility of compromise with those who seek not justice, but only the elimination of a dangerous opponent. Instead of the promised transfer to a church prison where she would be guarded by women, Joan finds herself returned to the same English fortress where her treatment becomes even more harsh than before. Her male clothing, which she had agreed to abandon, mysteriously reappears in her cell, and when she puts it on, whether from practical necessity or divine compulsion, her enemies have the excuse they need to condemn her as a relapsed heretic. The final session of her trial takes place on May 28th, with Joan once again facing her judges, but now in a position from which there can be no retreat. When asked why she has resumed male clothing and renewed her claims about divine revelation, her response carries the weight of absolute finality. "I have done nothing against God or the faith, whatever I may have confessed. I did not understand what was in the schedule of abjuration. I did not intend to deny my visions or my voices, for they come from God." With these words, Joan seals her earthly fate, but secures her historical immortality. The judges, having finally achieved the legal framework necessary for her execution, condemn her to death as a relapsed heretic. Yet in doing so, they transform their victim from a military opponent into a martyr whose influence will far exceed anything she achieved as a warrior. The night before her execution, Joan spends in prayer and preparation for what she believes will be her translation from earthly to eternal service of the divine will. In her cell, surrounded by the darkness of human hatred, but illuminated by the light of divine love, she prepares to teach her final lesson about the power of faith to overcome even death itself. The peasant girl who challenged the greatest powers of her age has become something her enemies never anticipated. A teacher whose classroom is eternity, and whose students will include generations yet unborn, who will learn from her example that individual conscience, guided by divine truth, can indeed move mountains and change the course of history itself. The morning of May 30th, 1431, dawns grey and uncertain over the city of Rouen, as if the sky itself hesitates to witness what is about to unfold in the ancient marketplace that has seen so much of human history, the buying and selling of ordinary goods, the celebration of harvest festivals, the proclamation of royal edicts. Today, it will witness something that transforms an ordinary Tuesday into a moment that echoes through eternity. Joan awakens in her cell before dawn, as has been her custom throughout her captivity. The sound of her prayers, whispered in the darkness of the fortress tower, carries to the guards who have watched over her through these final months. Some of these men, hardened soldiers accustomed to the brutalities of medieval warfare, find themselves moved by the faith and courage of their prisoner. They have expected to guard a broken woman, defeated by the processes of law and theology. Instead, they have witnessed a spirit that grows stronger under persecution, a light that burns brighter as earthly shadows deepen around it. Her final preparations are simple but profound. She asks for and receives the sacraments of the Church, confession, communion, the last rites that prepare a Christian soul for its journey beyond mortality. The priests who administer these sacred mysteries find themselves in the presence of someone whose faith makes their own seem small and uncertain. Here is a young woman facing death with the serenity of a saint, the courage of a martyr, the hope of someone who knows that what appears to be an ending is actually a beginning. The wooden stake that has been erected in the marketplace stands 15 feet high, surrounded by bundles of dry wood that will ensure the flames burn hot and quickly. This is not meant to be a prolonged torment, but a definitive end to the career of someone whose very existence has become a threat to established order. Yet the authorities who have arranged this execution understand that they are dealing with forces beyond their control, that Joan's death may accomplish exactly the opposite of what they intend. As the hour of execution approaches, crowds begin to gather in the marketplace. They come from every level of Rouen society, English officials and French citizens, clergy and merchants, soldiers and craftsmen, nobles and peasants. Many are drawn by simple curiosity about the famous maid whose story has captured the imagination of Europe. Others come with deeper purposes, supporters hoping to witness a miracle that will save their heroine, enemies seeking confirmation that divine justice supports their cause. The procession that escorts Joan from the castle to the marketplace moves through streets lined with people whose faces reflect the complex emotions that her story has awakened. Some weep openly at the sight of the young woman who lifted the Siege of Orléans, now walking toward her death. Others watch with the satisfaction of those who believe they are witnessing the just punishment of a dangerous heretic. Most simply stare in wonder at someone who has become legend while still alive, trying to reconcile the ordinary appearance of the prisoner with the extraordinary claims made about her career. Joan herself moves through this gauntlet of human emotion with the same composure that has marked all her public appearances. Dressed in a simple white shift, her head covered, but her face visible to the crowd, she embodies a dignity that no earthly authority can diminish. When jeers arise from some sections of the crowd, she responds not with anger, but with prayers for the salvation of those who mock her. When expressions of support reach her ears, she acknowledges them with looks of gratitude, but keeps her focus on the spiritual preparations that occupy her mind. The platform erected for the execution rises above the crowd like an altar of sacrifice, and indeed, that is precisely what Joan understands it to be. As she climbs the wooden steps, assisted by the executioner, who seems almost reluctant to perform his assigned task, she looks out over the sea of faces that surround her. Many of these people have heard her story, have followed her victories, have debated among themselves whether she is saint or sorceress. Now they will witness the moment that transforms her from a historical figure into an eternal symbol. The formal pronouncement of her sentence fills the morning air with legal language that seems almost absurd in its contrast to the simple faith of the condemned woman. The charges of heresy, sorcery, and relapse are read with ceremonial precision, as if the elaborate theological constructions that justify this execution could somehow make it just. Joan listens without visible emotion, her attention focused not on the words of her earthly judges, but on the voices of her heavenly counselors that she hears even in this final hour. When given the opportunity to speak final words, Joan's response reveals both her human fears and her divine certainty. "I forgive all those who have condemned me," she says, her voice carrying clearly across the marketplace, despite the tears that now flow freely down her face. "I pray that my death will not bring punishment upon my king or my people. France will be free, for God's will cannot be defeated by human malice." The technical preparation for her execution proceeds with the mechanical efficiency that characterizes all official procedures in medieval society. Joan is bound to the stake with chains that hold her upright, while allowing her hands sufficient freedom to hold the small cross that a sympathetic English soldier has improvised from 2 pieces of wood. Around her feet, the executioner arranges bundles of faggots with professional competence, ensuring that the fire will burn efficiently while remaining as merciful as such a death can be. Yet even in these final moments, something occurs that witnesses will remember and count for generations. As the flames begin to lick at the base of the pyre, Joan's voice rises above the crackling of burning wood in a cry that pierces the hearts of everyone present. "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" The name that has been her strength throughout her mission becomes her final word on earth, repeated until the smoke and flames make speech impossible. The crowd that watches her death becomes part of the historical record through their reactions to what they witness. Many weep openly, moved by the courage and faith they see displayed in the flames. Others fall to their knees in prayer, sensing that they are present at something that transcends ordinary human experience. Some of the English officials who have orchestrated this execution begin to show signs of doubt about what they have accomplished, wondering if they have created a martyr whose influence will far exceed that of the living woman they have destroyed. Most remarkable of all are the signs and wonders that witnesses later report seeing in the flames themselves. Soldiers swear they saw Joan's heart refuse to burn, remaining intact while everything else was consumed by fire. Priests claim to have observed a white dove rising from the smoke, flying toward heaven as the flames reached their peak. Whether these accounts reflect physical reality or spiritual truth, they reveal the profound impact that Joan's death has upon those who witness it. The execution's immediate aftermath demonstrates the English authorities' awareness that they have miscalculated badly. Instead of eliminating a dangerous opponent, they have created something far more threatening, a martyr whose story will inspire resistance for generations to come. Orders go out immediately to scatter Joan's ashes in the Seine River, ensuring that no relics can be preserved that might become focal points for veneration. Yet they cannot erase the memory of what thousands of people have witnessed, cannot undo the transformation of a military commander into a saint. News of Joan's execution spreads across Europe with the speed that attends all events of transcendent importance. In France, the reaction is immediate and electric. Churches hold memorial masses, poets compose verses celebrating her heroism, and common people speak her name with the reverence reserved for saints. Most importantly, French resistance to English occupation intensifies rather than diminishes, as if Joan's death has kindled fires that her life could never have ignited. The political consequences unfold over the months and years that follow. King Charles VII, whose legitimacy Joan established through divine intervention, continues the work of liberation that she began. Town after town opens its gates to French forces, inspired by the memory of the Maid who proved that English power could be broken. The Burgundian alliance with England, already strained by political changes, crumbles entirely as Duke Philip recognizes that the tide of war has turned permanently against the occupying forces. Within 20 years of Joan's death, the last English stronghold on French soil, save only the port of Calais, falls to French armies fighting under banners that bear her memory. The 100 Years' War, that seemingly endless conflict that had devastated France for generations, comes to an end not through diplomatic negotiation, but through the kind of decisive military victory that Joan had always proclaimed was possible with divine assistance. The English themselves, perhaps understanding too late the magnitude of their error, begin almost immediately to distance themselves from Joan's execution. Military commanders who had supported her trial find their careers in decline. Political leaders who had celebrated her death discover that their names will be forever associated with one of history's great injustices. Most significantly, the theological arguments used to justify her condemnation are quietly abandoned as the Church itself begins to recognize the true nature of what occurred in Rouen. The process of Joan's rehabilitation begins less than 25 years after her death, when Charles VII requests that the Pope examine the circumstances of her trial and execution. The investigation that follows reveals the extensive procedural violations, political pressures, and theological errors that characterized the original proceedings. In 1456, Pope Calixtus III formally nullifies Joan's conviction, declaring that she was wrongfully condemned and that her accusers were guilty of fraud, calumny, and procedural misconduct. Yet Joan's true legacy extends far beyond the correction of legal errors or the vindication of her personal reputation. In the centuries that follow her death, her story becomes a touchstone for everyone who faces seemingly impossible odds, who confronts overwhelming authority with nothing but personal conviction, who believes that individual faith can indeed change the course of history. During the Reformation, both Protestant and Catholic writers claim Joan as a symbol of their causes, Protestants seeing in her an example of individual conscience triumphing over corrupt institutional authority. Catholics viewing her as proof that God continues to work miracles through the Church and its saints. Her story transcends these theological divisions to speak to something deeper in human nature, the longing for heroes who embody the possibility that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when guided by transcendent purpose. The Renaissance rediscovers Joan as an embodiment of humanistic ideals about individual potential and human dignity. Enlightenment thinkers, including Voltaire, find in her story a critique of religious superstition and political tyranny, though they often miss the essential spiritual dimension that motivated all her actions. Romantic poets and novelists of the 18th and 19th centuries transform her into a symbol of nationalism and popular sovereignty, seeing in her peasant origins and royal achievements proof that true legitimacy comes from the people rather than from hereditary privilege. In her own land of France, Joan's memory becomes inseparable from the national identity itself. During periods of foreign occupation or political crisis, French leaders invoke her example to rally popular resistance and remind their countrymen of what can be accomplished when the nation unites behind a common purpose. Napoleon claims her inspiration for his own rise from obscurity to imperial power. The leaders of the French Revolution see in her story validation of their belief that the common people can overthrow established authority when motivated by righteous cause. Most remarkably, in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her death, the Catholic Church formally canonizes Joan as Saint Joan of Arc, recognizing officially what millions of believers had known for generations, that the peasant girl from Domrémy had indeed been chosen by God for a mission that transcended the political and military circumstances of her time. The ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica draws pilgrims from around the world, all coming to honor someone whose brief life had demonstrated the reality of divine intervention in human affairs. The 20th century brings new dimensions to Joan's legacy as her story resonates with movements for women's rights, national liberation, and resistance to totalitarian authority. During the Second World War, both the French resistance and the collaborationist Vichy government claim her symbol, though history has judged which side better understood her true message. Leaders of independence movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America find inspiration in the example of someone who drove foreign occupiers from her homeland through a combination of military skill and moral authority. In our own time, Joan's story continues to speak to new generations who face their own challenges and opportunities. Young women find in her an example of someone who refused to accept the limitations that society placed upon her gender, who proved that divine calling transcends human conventions about what is possible or appropriate. People of faith see in her life confirmation that God continues to work through individuals who open themselves completely to divine will, regardless of their social status or worldly qualifications. Scholars and historians continue to debate the details of her career, the exact nature of her visions, the extent of her military contributions, the political implications of her mission. Yet these academic discussions, valuable as they are for understanding the historical context of her time, cannot diminish the essential truth that her life proclaims: that individual human beings, when motivated by transcendent purpose and sustained by unwavering faith, can indeed change the course of history in ways that seem impossible by ordinary standards. Perhaps most importantly, Joan's legacy reminds us that the most powerful forces in human history are often spiritual rather than material, that ideas and ideals can prove stronger than armies and empires, that truth spoken by a single voice can echo longer than the pronouncements of kings and councils. Her story suggests that what appears to be defeat, the execution of a 19-year-old peasant girl in a marketplace in Rouen, can actually be victory of the most profound and lasting kind. In the quiet hours of evening, when the day's struggles and challenges have ended, and the mind turns toward deeper questions about meaning and purpose, Joan's story offers both comfort and challenge. Comfort, because it demonstrates that God can work through the most unlikely instruments to accomplish divine purposes. Challenge, because it calls each person to consider whether they, like Joan, are willing to surrender their own will completely to a purpose greater than themselves. The bells that ring each evening across the French countryside, from the great cathedrals of Paris and Reims to the simple parish churches of villages like Domrémy, carry on the wind something of the message that Joan proclaimed with her life. France endures, faith triumphs, and the human spirit, when touched by divine grace, can achieve victories that confound all earthly calculations. As night falls over the land that Joan lived and died to serve, as stars appear in the vast darkness above the fields where she once heard the voices of angels, her legacy lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, truth over convenience, faith over doubt. The peasant girl from Domrémy has become immortal, not through the preservation of her mortal remains, but through the eternal truth that her life proclaimed, that with God all things are possible, and that individual faith, however humble its origins, can indeed move mountains and change the world. In the end, Joan of Arc belongs not just to France or to the 15th century, but to all humanity and all time. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not just by the powerful and the privileged, but by those who hear the voice of a conscience and respond with everything they have to give. In a world that often seems dominated by cynicism and despair, she remains a beacon of hope, proving that one life lived in complete dedication to truth and justice can illuminate the darkness for countless generations to come. The mist that rises from the river valleys of France each morning carries with it something of the mystery and the promise that surrounded Joan's brief but world-changing career. Like that mist, her influence is invisible, yet real, gentle yet transformative, touching everything it encounters with the possibility that this day, too, might witness the impossible becoming possible through the power of faith and the grace of God. And so, the story ends as it began. In the quiet countryside of France, where church bells ring across peaceful fields, and ordinary people go about their daily tasks, sustained by the knowledge that their land was once home to someone who proved that heaven and earth can work together to accomplish miracles that no human power could imagine or achieve. Joan of Arc sleeps now in the eternal peace of those who have served faithfully and well, but her legacy awakens each morning with the sun, calling new generations to discover what wonders might unfold when human will aligns perfectly with divine purpose. The end.